The North Atlantic, in the waning days of August 1780, was a theater of gray hostility. The ocean heaved with the long, rolling swells characteristic of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, a maritime graveyard where the cold currents of the Labrador swept down to meet the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream. Here, the fog was a constant shroud, dampening sound and obscuring vision, turning the act of navigation into a perilous game of chance. Through this nebulous seascape, the Continental packet Mercury cut a solitary and precarious furrow. She was a vessel of modest dimensions, a brigantine built for speed and dispatch rather than the thunderous broadsides of the line of battle. On her quarterdeck, or perhaps confined below by the agonizing throes of his chronic ailment, was Henry Lawrence. At 56, he was a man of immense stature in the rebellious colonies, a wealthy merchant from Charleston, a former president of the Continental Congress, and now the minister plenipotentiary to the United Provinces of the Netherlands. His mission was as fragile as the wooden hull that carried him. He bore the weight of a nation's bankruptcy on his shoulders, tasked with securing a $10 million loan from the Dutch and finalizing a treaty of amity and commerce that would bring the financial might of Amsterdam into the war against Great Britain. The voyage had begun with a calculated gamble. The Mercury had slipped out of Philadelphia on August 13, 1780, under the protective shadow of the sloop of war Saratoga. For days, the two vessels had sailed in concert, the Saratoga providing a screen against the patrolling frigates of the Royal Navy. But the escort was bound by its own orders and the limits of its endurance. Once they were well out to sea, beyond the immediate coastal blockade where the danger was deemed most acute, the Saratoga had turned back, her sails dissolving into the western horizon. The Mercury was left to face the Atlantic alone. For Henry Lawrence, the isolation was palpable. He was a man accustomed to command and control, yet here he was subject to the whims of the wind and the tactical acumen of his captain, William Pickles. Pickles was a competent mariner, entrusted by Congress with one of their most valuable diplomatic assets, but he commanded a ship that was fundamentally outmatched by the predators hunting in these waters. The Mercury was armed, but her defense lay in her heels, not her guns. As September dawned, the vessel approached the Newfoundland Banks, a region teeming not with cod, but with British cruisers. The Royal Navy, stung by the resilience of the American privateers and the intervention of the French, had tightened its net. Admiral Edwards, commanding the Newfoundland station, had dispatched his frigates to scour the shipping lanes for American traffic. On the morning of September 3, 1780, the lookout's cry shattered the monotonous rhythm of the watch. A sail had been sighted on the horizon. The reaction aboard the Mercury was immediate. Captain Pickles ordered the course altered, the yards braced around to catch every breath of wind. The stranger was hull down at first, a mere speck against the gray, but the geometry of the chase soon revealed the grim truth. The pursuing vessel was larger, carrying a cloud of canvas that spoke of a rated warship. It was HMS Vestal, a 28-gun frigate, fresh from the shipyards and copper-bottomed for speed. Under the command of Captain George Keppel, the Vestal was a predator perfectly adapted to this environment. She was fast, heavily armed with 12-pounders, and manned by a crew eager for prize money. To make matters worse, she was not alone. The sloop of war Ferry, commanded by Captain Berkeley, was also in the vicinity, effectively boxing the Mercury into a corridor of capture. For 5 or 6 grueling hours, the chase unfolded across the heaving Atlantic. The Mercury strained, her timbers groaning as Pickles pushed her to the breaking point. Every knot of speed was squeezed from the rigging. Lawrence, despite the excruciating pain of gout that inflamed his legs, a malady that would become a central character in his coming ordeal, monitored the pursuit with the stoicism of a veteran statesman. He knew the stakes. He was not merely a prisoner of war in waiting, he was the holder of state secrets that could widen the global conflict. The gap narrowed. The Vestal, riding the wind with the relentless purpose of the Royal Navy, closed the distance. The jagged silhouette of the British frigate grew clearer, the tiered guns, the red ensign snapping at the peak, the swarm of figures on the deck and in the fighting tops. The Mercury had run her race. She was outsailed and outgunned. To fight would be suicide. A single broadside from the Vestal could reduce the packet to driftwood. Captain Pickles looked at the looming frigate, then at his own flag. The decision was military and inevitable. He gave the order to strike the colors. The Mercury came up into the wind, her sails shivering, surrendering to the overwhelming force of His Majesty's Navy. The chase was over, but for Henry Lawrence the true crisis was just beginning. As the Mercury drifted violently in the trough of the waves, the silence of surrender was replaced by the frantic activity of a ship preparing to be boarded. The wind whistled through the rigging, now a mournful accompaniment to the disaster. Aboard the packet, the crew scrambled to secure their personal meager possessions, hiding coins or keepsakes from the prying eyes of the impending prize crew. For Henry Lawrence, however, the priority was not personal wealth, but political survival. He stood in the cabin, or perhaps on the quarterdeck, surrounded by the apparatus of his diplomatic mission. He was the custodian of a trunk filled with documents, the lifeblood of the American cause in Europe. The specific inventory of these papers was terrifying in its significance. There was the general correspondence of Congress, detailing the dire financial straits of the Revolution. There were letters to the French court, but most damning of all was the draft treaty of amity and commerce between the United States and the Netherlands. This document, negotiated in secret by William Lee and the pensionary of Amsterdam, Van Berkel, was explosive. The Netherlands was officially neutral. Proof of their negotiation with the rebels would give Great Britain the casus belli, the justification for war it had been seeking to dismantle Dutch naval power before the Republic could join the League of Armed Neutrality. Lawrence turned to his secretary, Major Moses Young. The time for diplomacy was past. The time for destruction had arrived. They had anticipated this moment, at least in theory. The instructions were clear. Destroy the papers rather than let them fall into enemy hands. "The papers," Lawrence ordered. "We must sink them." The two men, hindered by the rolling of the ship and Lawrence's physical infirmity, gathered the critical documents. They bypassed the trunk of useless papers, personal correspondence and minor administrative logs, and focused on the diplomatic pouch. They shoved the draft treaty, the commissions, and the secret letters into a canvas bag. To ensure the bag would plunge immediately to the abyssal plains of the Atlantic, they added ballast. Iron shot, cannonballs or heavy musket shot, was stuffed into the sack alongside the parchment. The weight felt substantial, heavy enough to drag a man down, let alone a bundle of paper. The Vestal had hove to a short distance away, her gun ports open, the dark muzzles of her 12-pounders trained on the Mercury. A cutter was already in the water, oars flashing in the sunlight, carrying a lieutenant and a squad of Royal Marines to take possession of the prize. The distance was closing rapidly, hundreds of yards becoming dozens. Lawrence dragged the weighted bag to the rail. The damp salt air stung his face. He looked down at the churning water, the color of slate and foam. This was the final line of defense. If the papers vanished, he would be a prisoner, yes, but a prisoner without evidence. He would be Henry Lawrence, gentleman and merchant, not Henry Lawrence, agent of a hostile alliance. He heaved the bag over the gunwale. Time seemed to suspend as the canvas sack tumbled through the air. It struck the water with a heavy splash, churning the whitecap. Lawrence leaned over the rail, expecting, praying, to see it plummet like a stone, disappearing into the dark green depths, gone forever. But it did not sink. A pocket of air, trapped within the folds of the canvas or between the stacks of paper, fought against the iron shot. The buoyancy of the trapped atmosphere was, for a few agonizing seconds, equal to the drag of the metal. The bag bobbed. It dipped, submerged for a heartbeat, and then broke the surface again, drifting on the swell like a buoy. Lawrence watched in horror. The bag was a dark, visible blot on the water. It was not sinking. It was floating, and the British boat was approaching. The coxswain in the stern of the British cutter spotted the object. In the lexicon of naval warfare, a package thrown from a prize at the moment of the capture was a beacon of intelligence. It signaled something that the enemy was desperate to hide. "Hook that bag!" the cry went up. The British cutter altered course, the oarsman digging in hard to swing the bow toward the drifting canvas. Lawrence gripped the rail of the Mercury, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bag was mere yards from the British boat. If it sank now, in the next 10 seconds, the secrets were safe. If it floated for 20 seconds more, the war would change. A British sailor in the bow of the cutter stood up, balancing against the roll of the sea. He extended a boat hook, a long ash pole tipped with iron, reaching out across the gap. The hook hung in the air, poised to snag the canvas loops of the bag. The bag bobbed on a crest. The sailor lunged. The narrative of the capture pauses on the water. The hook extended, the fate of nations suspended on the buoyancy of a canvas sack. The scene shifts now to the consequences of that day, moving from the open sea to the claustrophobic stone of London. Following the capture, Henry Lawrence was transferred to the HMS Vestal. Captain George Keppel received him with a chivalry that belied the violence of the chase. "Captain Keppel received me on board in a style humane and polite," Lawrence later recorded. When Lawrence offered his sword and purse, the traditional tokens of surrender, Keppel declined them, allowing the American dignitary to retain his dignity. The Vestal, with the Mercury as a prize, set a course for St. John's, Newfoundland. There, under the scrutiny of Admiral Edwards, the true gravity of the situation began to crystallize. The initial assessment of Lawrence as a mere rebel shifted to that of a high-value state prisoner. The decision was made to transport him immediately to England. He was placed aboard the sloop-of-war Ferry, commanded by Captain Berkeley, and later Keppel, who took command of the ferry for the voyage, for the Atlantic crossing. The voyage was a trial of endurance. The ferry was a small vessel, tossing violently in the autumnal gales. Lawrence, his gout inflamed by the damp and the diet of ship's biscuit and salt beef, suffered immensely. Yet the speed of the crossing was remarkable. They reached Dartmouth on the southern coast of Devon in just 10 days, landing on September 29, 1780. From Dartmouth, the journey to London was a slow, painful procession. Lawrence was too ill to travel rapidly. He was escorted by Lieutenant Hugh Norris and a guard, moving by coach through Exeter and the English countryside. They arrived in London on the evening of October 5, 1780. The capital was buzzing with rumors of his capture. The press had already begun to speculate on the President of the Congress and the secrets he carried. On October 6th, the theater of his confinement moved to Whitehall. Lawrence was brought before the highest authorities of the British government, Lord Stormont, Lord George Germain, and Lord Hillsborough, the Secretaries of State who directed the war effort. The interrogation was a collision of legal philosophies. The British ministers viewed Lawrence as a subject in rebellion, a traitor to the crown. Lawrence viewed himself as the representative of a sovereign nation. "Is your name Henry Lawrence?" Lord Stormont asked. "Certainly, my lord, that is my name," Lawrence replied, refusing to evade his identity. They presented him with the papers, the very documents from the floating bag. "Mr. Lawrence, we have a paper here," Stormont said, holding up the draft treaty, "purporting to be a commission from Congress to you." Lawrence refused to answer questions that would incriminate his government. He stood firm on his diplomatic immunity, though the British recognized no such status. The interrogation ended with a grim pronouncement. Lord Stormont informed him that he was to be committed to the Tower of London on suspicion of high treason. This charge was specific and lethal. It was not prisoner of war. It was treason. The punishment was death. The transfer to the Tower was conducted with a mixture of secrecy and spectacle. Lawrence was placed in a close hackney coach to avoid the mob, escorted by Colonel Williamson and two ill-looking fellows, King's messengers. They drove through the darkening streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares heading east toward the city. The Tower of London rose out of the twilight, a fortress of gray stone and bloody history. They arrived at the gates. Lawrence was handed over to the custody of the deputy lieutenant of the Tower, Major John Gore. The warrant was read aloud. The prisoner was to be kept safe and close. Safe and close was the terminology of the dungeon. It meant solitary confinement. It meant no pen, no ink, no paper, no visitors, no news. It was a silence designed to break the will. As Lawrence was led across the parade ground toward his cell, a curious and stinging incident occurred. The soldiers of the guard, seeing the American rebel, struck up a tune on their fifes. They played Yankee Doodle. It was intended as a mockery, a jeer at the ragtag army Lawrence represented, but the effect on the prisoner was profound. Lawrence did not bow his head. He lifted it. The tune, he later wrote, filled my mind with a sublime contempt and rather made me cheerful. To him, it was not a song of derision, but the anthem of his country, played in the heart of the enemy's fortress. He marched to his cell not as a criminal, but as a patriot. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the iron bolts were thrown. Henry Lawrence was now the only American prisoner in the Tower of London. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a small apartment, likely located in the vicinity of the lieutenant's lodgings or one of the secure towers such as the Bloody Tower or the dwellings near the White Tower. The silence was absolute, save for the changing of the guard and the tolling of the bells. The conditions of safe and close confinement were rigorously enforced. 2 warders, yeomen of the guard armed with halberds, were stationed permanently at his door. They were under strict orders. No conversation. Lawrence, a man whose life was built on discourse and negotiation, was starved of words. Physical deprivation soon followed the social isolation. The tower was damp, situated directly on the banks of the Thames, and the chill seeped into the stone walls. For a man suffering from severe gout, this was a torture device. Lawrence's legs swelled, his joints burned with the fire of the disease. He became much emaciated, a shadow of the vigorous figure who had sailed from Philadelphia. He could barely walk, often requiring support to move from his bed to his chair. Yet the British bureaucracy found ways to add insult to injury. In a practice that dated back to the medieval era, state prisoners in the Tower were expected to pay for their own imprisonment, their food, their bedding, and even the wages of their guards. Major Gore presented Lawrence with a bill for fees. The amount was staggering, $95.10. Lawrence looked at the bill. He looked at the lieutenant. His refusal was instant and cutting. "Sir, I believe I must change my lodgings. You grow too dear for me," he declared. He refused to pay. He reasoned that he was a prisoner of state, not a guest at an inn. If they wanted to lock him up, they would have to pay for the privilege. It was a small victory, but a significant assertion of his agency. Denied pen and ink to prevent him from communicating with the opposition in Parliament or the American agents in Paris, Laurent turned to the only tool available, a pencil. He possessed a small pencil and a memorandum book. With these, he began a clandestine war of correspondence. The mechanics of this secret mail service relied on the invisible networks of the city. A woman, her identity obscured in the records, sometimes speculated to be a sympathetic servant, a laundress, or perhaps a friend like Mrs. F., became his courier. Lawrence would write on scraps of paper, sometimes using invisible ink, fluids like lemon juice or milk that would appear when heated, or simply writing in faint pencil that could be easily erased or hidden. These pencil letters slipped through the stone walls. They reached his friends in London, including the merchant William Manning, whose daughter eventually married Lawrence's son John, and the radical press. Through these letters, Lawrence shaped the narrative of his own martyrdom. He complained of the harshness of his treatment, the cruelty of the ministers, and his steadfast refusal to betray his country. The British government, paranoid about his influence, suspected the invisible ink. They feared that the president was directing the war from his cell. They were not entirely wrong. As the year 1781 dragged on, the British ministry sought to convert their high-value prisoner into a political asset. The war in America was grinding into a stalemate in the North and a brutal civil war in the South. The British needed a symbolic victory. If Henry Lawrence, the former president of the Congress, could be induced to renounce the Revolution, it would be a devastating blow to American morale. The instrument of this temptation was Richard Oswald. Oswald was a Scottish merchant, a former partner of Lawrence in the slave trade, and a man who walked the line between the British establishment and American sympathies. He was not a jailer, but an old friend. He was granted permission to visit Lawrence in the Tower, bringing with him the soft power of the state. Oswald's proposition was seductive in its simplicity. "You can write 2 or 3 lines to the ministers," Oswald urged. "Barely say you are sorry for what is past. A pardon will be granted." The offer was clear. Apologize for the treason. Admit that the United States was a failed experiment. In exchange, Lawrence would be released. He could go to Bath to treat his gout. He could see his family. He could live out his days in comfort. Lawrence sat in his cell, his legs wrapped in flannel, his body broken by pain. But his mind was diamond hard. He looked at Oswald and delivered a rebuke that defined his character. "Sir, I will never subscribe to my own infamy and to the dishonor of my children," he said. He refused to accept the premise of the pardon. To accept a pardon is to admit guilt. Lawrence maintained he was innocent of any crime. He was a patriot acting for his country. "I have nothing to be sorry for," he insisted. The pressure intensified. Major Gore, perhaps frustrated by the prisoner's obstinacy, insinuated that the only way Lawrence would leave the Tower was to the execution block on Tower Hill. He hinted that Lawrence would die in that cell. Lawrence met this threat with a macabre vow of survival. "I shall not leave a bone with you," he told the lieutenant. He was determined that the Tower would not claim his corpse. He would outlive the ministry, outlive the war, and outlive the charge of treason. Events outside the Tower began to conspire in his favor. The very papers that had been captured with him, the ones that had failed to sink, had indeed caused the British to declare war on the Netherlands. But the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was becoming a strategic burden for Britain, stretching the Royal Navy to its breaking point. Then, in October 1781, the world turned upside down. News reached London of the catastrophe at Yorktown. Lord Cornwallis had surrendered his entire army to General Washington and the French. The dynamic of the war shifted instantly. The British government, reeling from the defeat, realized that the war was effectively lost. They also realized they had a problem. They held Henry Lawrence as a traitor, but the Americans held Lord Cornwallis as a prisoner of war. Lawrence was suddenly no longer a criminal to be hanged. He was a diplomat to be traded. The excessive politics of the North Ministry collapsed into the pragmatism of peace-seeking. On December 31, 1781, Henry Lawrence was brought before the King's Bench to be released on bail. He was carried in a sedan chair, too weak to stand. When the magistrate asked him to swear the condition of his bail upon our sovereign Lord the King, Lawrence, even at the threshold of freedom, could not suppress his revolutionary spirit. "Not my sovereign," he snapped. He was released. He was exchanged for Lord Cornwallis, a swap of a president for a general. He walked out of the Tower not as a broken man, but as a victor in the War of Wills. To fully understand the trajectory that led Henry Lawrence from the damp cell of the Tower to the peace tables of Paris, we must return to the suspended moment on the Atlantic Ocean, the moment the bag refused to sink. We resume the narrative on the swell of the Grand Banks, September 3, 1780. The British sailor in the bow of the cutter lunged with the boat hook. The iron tip slashed through the water. It caught the canvas strap of the floating bag. "Got it!" With a heave, the sailor hauled the dripping sack from the sea. It landed with a wet thud on the bottom boards of the cutter. The daring tar, later identified in some accounts as a man who leapt into the sea to support it, though the hook is the more likely instrument of salvation, had secured the prize. Lawrence, watching from the deck of the Mercury, felt the crushing weight of the failure. The physics of the air pocket had betrayed him. The iron shot had been insufficient. The secrets of the Congress were now in the possession of the Royal Navy. The bag was transferred to the Vestal. Captain Keppel ordered it opened. The contents were soaked but legible. As the papers were spread out to dry, the magnitude of the intelligence coup became apparent. There was the draft treaty. There were the letters detailing the loan. The consequences of this retrieval were tectonic. When the papers reached London, the British ministry used them as definitive proof that the Dutch were violating their neutrality. They used the contents of the bag to justify a preemptive declaration of war against the Netherlands. This expanded the conflict into a global naval war, drawing British resources away from the American coast and contributing to the overextension that made Yorktown possible. In a supreme irony, the capture of the bag, which seemed like a disaster for Lawrence, accelerated the end of the war. And what of Lawrence himself? The man who had been the prisoner of the Tower became the peacemaker. Following his release, he remained in Europe. Congress appointed him as one of the peace commissioners, alongside Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. In 1782, the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris began. The British representative sent to negotiate with the Americans was none other than Richard Oswald, Lawrence's old friend, his visitor in the Tower, the man who had urged him to apologize. The two men, formerly prisoner and intermediary, now sat as equals. Lawrence, though his health was permanently shattered by the Tower, he would never fully recover from the gout and the trauma, contributed to the final treaty. He insisted on a clause protecting American property, specifically preventing the British Army from carrying away any Negroes or other property. It was a clause born of his background as a Southern planter, a complex stain on the legacy of liberty, but it was enshrined in the document that recognized the United States. Henry Lawrence had thrown the bag to save his country. The British had hooked it to destroy his country. In the end, the papers started a war, the Tower forged a patriot, and the prisoner signed the peace. The daring tar on the Grand Banks had fished a treaty out of the water, but he had also fished out the man who would eventually sign the death warrant of the British Empire in America. As Lawrence returned to South Carolina in 1784, he carried the scars of the Tower and the triumph of the treaty. He had not left a bone with them. He had taken everything.